selling out died around 2000 because CD sales peaked in 99. And suddenly musicians started not making money and started having to look at the types of ads and deals that they had previously been able to shirk and say, nah, doing that is a sellout, right? In 1995, Kendrick Lamar would have not done an Amex commercial. That would have been selling out. These days now, that has been completely sublimated by capital. And the way it has occurred is that today, pop music or liking pop music or all that sort of stuff or wanting to be a billionaire has been able to retain a sort of semblance of cool vis-a-vis the dropping of virtue. Suddenly now, capitalism itself is cool.
Alex Ebert, welcome to the Metagame.
Thank you so much for having me, Daniel. This is a pleasure already.
Just before we hit record, you said something that's now on my mind. You said memes have made us more philosophical. What do you mean by that?
So there is an immediacy to memes. There is a contractive, consolidated quality to meme whereby information is compacted. Disparate information is compacted. And of course, we're used to this. We are used to montage, and we're used to the idea of stories and different images being placed next to each other. And we sort of enter through the ingresses and the spaces in between. But with the meme, it's all compacted into one place, into a single image. But now we're actually just creating them and we're exposing ourselves to them every day. And that compactment of nuance requires sort of a certain philosophic mind state. And the amount of information of nuance that is left out of those memes by necessity, because the memes are compacting information such that you no longer have the nuance. So you don't have the nuance in the meme. So you have to bring the nuance to the meme. And in that sense, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of deigning and sort of like daimonic work there, where it's like, in order to even make sense of a meme, you have to sort of engage this nuance production. And a lot of these memes leave you in a state that is in some sort of gray area, in some limbo. There's a lot of like indefinitude in the most popular memes, a lot of like, what does that mean? I mean, there's now philosophers of memes who try and make sense of memes for you, and there's so many different ways, and you can take one format and have it mean a whole bunch of different things. Same meme format can be used by the alt-right and by the left and by the center and, all the different little mimetic tribes. So yeah, I think that there is a return, in a sense, by that consolidation stripping out of nuance. There's a return of the requirement of nuance, in that a whole story is contained in a single image if you can fill in the blanks. And that's interesting, And I think that we don't really think of ourselves as philosophers, right? We don't think of these meme posters, these shit posters out there as philosophers. But I think in a lot of ways, that's what's happening, that philosophy is the new pop.
Yeah, the word that came to mind was compression, and how the internet tends to compress things. Like Twitter, you have to compress an idea into however many characters, or Instagram, you have like an image or a series of images that compresses somebody's identity into, a brand or something like that. And memes are like the art form of compression, right? Like it's like there's so much information being conveyed in one image, and they tend to be funny and they tend to make callback humor to other memes. And there's a question of what level to interpret the meme on. And it's almost how, because they're so compressed, because you don't have that much bandwidth to play with them, it forces you to be more philosophical in the way you interact with it, because you don't know what level to interpret the meme on. Sometimes it's it's like a callback to something that you just didn't have the context for, so you don't actually get it. Or sometimes it is just, interpreted at the most sincere level.
And that callback necessity. And by the way, I'm glad you brought up compression, because that's actually a word that I've trained myself to stop using because it's confused so many people. But you clearly, it's not going to confuse you, and hopefully it won't confuse your audience. But um, compression is sort of that's the name of the game. It's not only the name of the game in terms of memes and compressing information, but information theory, compressing information into bits and bytes and thumb drives, and compressing it in order to communicate it. Everything must be compressed to be communicated. We're compressing our ideas into language, into symbols, and then communicating so they can be delivered. And the more you compress something, the faster it can be delivered. And the meme, in some ways, is the fastest medium that we've ever seen, because it's all compressed into a single spot. All these disparate images and disparate ideas are compressed into a very single location. And I love the thing you brought up later, was that when we don't have context for a meme, we feel like we don't necessarily understand it. And it actually induces a sensation of FOMO. Mm-hmm. And it induces the whole paradigm of status anxiety around cool. And there's a great joke that I love to tell that you may have heard me tell before, but it goes, how many hipsters does it take to screw in a light bulb? What, you don't know? Right. And the idea is like, only the hip really know how many hipsters it takes to screw in a light bulb. And if you don't know, you're not part of the club, pal, and you're on the outside. You don't get to belong to that sort of like nested hierarchy of cool. And memes are like that. Memes compress content such that, the best meme posters will intentionally leave out any context, so that it feels like you have to have gone through certain protocols and certain crucibles in order to even grasp the meme. And in that way, this is like the fucking Rites of Eleusinian mysteries, right? It's like you only get each meme is a compressed philosopher's stone. And the more compressed it is, the higher the level of philosopher you have to be to even understand it. And it's a pretty interesting time to communicate information.
Yeah. And, for those listening, we obviously just jumped into something, and maybe people feel like they're on the outside of it, but just to kind of invite you in. So I was saying this earlier, I see you as a philosopher, and that's how I've encountered your stuff. But most people probably know you from Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros, and from your work as a musician. And I actually think these two things are very related. And it's almost like if you are a sincere enough or committed enough artist or musician, you end up encountering philosophy. And the same is true from the other way around. And I wonder if you agree with that, and maybe to what extent that's been true in your whole journey.
I mean, to me, that's true. I feel like I meet a lot of musicians for whom that let me back up. I don't want to denigrate musicians. I think that all musicians I meet experience something akin to the relationship between absence and excess. That there is a certain absence to the excess of the ecstatic moment, and that there is a certain excess to that absence, and that confrontation with that sort of apophatic God space, that universal sort of congealment of humanity and music and sound and being, that sort of psychic connectivity that is truly required to be in a musical space with other people. And certainly I think that all musicians that experience that at that sort of level are confronted with that ultimately unspeakable, indeterminate ratio of absence and excess. Yet the extent to which they want to engage with that further, or ever want to even talk about that, there's a funny story that I have where I had just won this Golden Globe, and so I'm in the glow of of this whole thing in other people's eyes too. And Bono and Robert Redford are having a conversation, and Bono or Redford goes, "Alex, come here," and he brings me into the conversation, and they're talking about something or other, some funny thing, and then Redford goes, "You know who really understands silence? This guy," and he points at me, and Bono and Redford turn to me, and I was like, immediately, I was like, oh, what an amazing opportunity to talk about this indeterminate ratio of excess and absence, because the silence is sort of this ingress to the excess, that the only nothing is spawned by immanence, you know? And so I launch into this thing. And their faces just go fucking pale, and their smiles just crumble off their face, and that was the end of the conversation. It was like, okay, see you later. So I tell that story to say that he understands silence, but we don't necessarily want to talk about it like in any sort of, philosophical sense. We don't necessarily want to get into it or understand it or anything like that, but just to say that, this is a thing. And I think that there's a wisdom in that, in that sort of like apophatic sort of remove. But that is not my connection to it. I mean, the magnetic zeros themselves were a mathematics before it was a band. It was a mathematics I invented without knowing anything about mathematics, while I was simultaneously inventing my own version of string theory, because I'd figured out what nothing truly was, that nothing was a compression. And depending on the compression of zero, there's different zeros, and they exert different magnitudes on space and draw things into it. And so I had this whole rubric of zeros and nothing that were these magnetic zeros, which is still the foundation of my philosophy today. But the extent to which, I meet musicians who are equally interested in, esoteric shit, I wish was more in a certain sense, because you share such a visceral, spiritual connection with musicians when you play with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something there that reminds me of how it's impolite to dissect a joke, and how a lot of people don't like the idea of getting like too philosophical or too like technical about humor, or something else that, people like to keep
Totally.
mysterious, like, human relationships and things like that. And I think there's wisdom in that. There's wisdom in leaving things unsaid or expressing them in non-conceptual terms. But I'm very interested in the most artistic forms of concepts, like the appropriate use of language, like what true philosophy actually is, when it's not just kind of like a language game or some intellectual circle jerk. And I feel like the people that are good at that, they tend to be more than just philosophers. They tend to have a life outside of their language games. And I feel that's true for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true for me. I think that the main qualifier to me is like, are you, I don't know if there's a better term for this, but like, where's your diamond? Like, are you turned on by like, to what extent is your spirit moved? Because that's in some ways the only important factor in philosophy to me. But that's the reason why I'm an autodidact. It's the reason why I care. It's the reason why I get excited. It's the reason why I get out of my twin bed in the morning. It's like, it's the driver, and it's the reason why I make music. It's the reason why I cook. It's the reason why I like to not look at recipes and experiment, or get in touch with whatever it is that's driving me in the moment. And yeah, I think that for me, philosophy in some ways is all of those things boiled down into a word. It's like, it's all encompassing.
Yeah. The way I understand that is there is a vital energy, some people call it the daimon, or like libido or vitality itself or something, some sort of life force that we can develop a relationship with, and it almost has its own ambitions for us. And it's like when people say that they discovered something when they created it, they didn't actually create it, or they have a relationship with the muse. The muse visits them, the daimon visits them. And this is like a huge topic in my personal life. I've always been trying to find ways in which to develop a better relationship with that inner voice or those instincts, or I'm trying to use different language to resonate with different people. And one of the things I found is, coming back to what you said earlier, silence is kind of the most important thing. Like some form of nothingness is needed, some sort of openness is needed in order to hear what this life force, energy, daimon thing has to say. And so I'm curious about, I guess, like, do you have any practices for developing a relationship with that voice?
Yeah, I have. I have a practice that is no practice. I'm almost sort of like emphatically chaotic. When people ask me, "How do you get your sound?" I say, "Rushing." Because the problem with success is that you end up having too many tools at your disposal. And so, in some ways, the only constriction that remains that can be your ally is time. And to constrain yourself with time such that, if I have an impulse, I just go. And what that ends up meaning is that I end up having myriad projects all over the place, all in different states and conditions, none of them finished. And my manager freaking out, thinking I'm fucking insane. And it's completely, like almost immune to success, and constantly creating moments of self-immolation. But what that does, because the brand, I end up redundancy ends up becoming sort of foreign to the process, because redundancy is not necessarily, what gets the muses off. And in fact, I generally find that, if you get successful at something and you start repeating that success, the muses just leave, because it's like they have nothing more to contribute. And so that by remaining in sort of a state of becoming, I end up tapping on and landing on all these sort of predicate states of being where I have these moments of success and these moments of completion. But as soon as those moments of completion have occurred, that process has died. And of course, I can take that process and start distributing it across time as a redundancy, as a brand, and gain traction and success and money and all those sorts of things. But I have found that those things, that process, if followed long enough, kill me. And I'm just not that interested in that. So my process in some ways is to constantly stay moving and aware of where my joy is pointing. And sometimes it's very, very difficult. And that's to say that what I'm describing is not a willy-nilly sort of like, easy whistling Dixie sort of protocol. It's actually really tough,
right,
to leave predicate states of success. So you end up succeeding at this, or you do that, and this thing works in a show. Oh, I said this thing before this one song, and I played the song in that way, and it was wildly successful. I should repeat that tonight. And then I'll repeat it the next night, and the next night, and the next night, and the next night. And then all of a sudden, the schema, the raw schema itself, ends up hollowing out and subsisting as its own entity without the need for spirit inhabiting it. And that state all of a sudden robs you of any sense of vitality, because the thing doesn't even need vitality. It's just this formula. And so anyway, the thing that's tough is leaving that predicate state and jumping off again, because you get comfortable in that predicate state. You know that it works. I am this works, this is that, I am that. All these things are working as that. and yet that externalization of the self into that which works as this image robs us of our spirit, in my experience. So the difficult part is being like, okay, fuck it, and I'm going to leap again. Sometimes I have gotten into a place where I've become so much of that. And in a funny twist of fate, the time I experienced this the most was in a band called I'm a Robot. And that name itself ended up becoming sort of central to this plight. Is like, I really felt like I'd become a robot. I was on a major label and I was making songs that I thought would be successful because they had this specific sort of formula, and I had engaged myself and my ego with sort of proving myself to my manager and the label, and leaving that, you can engage with that so much in my experience that you can know, if you can stop and be like, okay, I'm going to experience silence and see where the diamond is and experience that repose and just kind of wait for it to come. And I did that, and I waited and I waited and nothing came. And I was like, what the fuck? Where did I go? And it didn't come. And I had become, at that point, I became very, very, very suicidal because I'd never experienced that before in my life. I felt like I had no instinct any longer. And before I killed myself, I was like, okay, maybe I'm going to kill myself. Like, seriously, I think maybe I'll kill myself. But just before that, I had an idea. I was like, I'm going to try this out. I reminded myself of when the last time I felt purely free was, and purely instinctual. And it was when I was 5 years old. So I pretended, okay, I'm going to pretend I'm 5 years old. And I'm just so grateful that I had this instinct. I guess it was my last remaining instinct, was to imitate myself at 5. And I literally just imitated myself at 5. I was walk around, pat my chest, look at stuff, like pretend stuff was novel to me. Like, oh, look at these shoes. They're blah, blah, blah. It was really hokey and really stupid. And it worked. And within a couple days of constantly pretending I was 5 years old, and writing songs as if I was 5, as if I didn't know what a verse or a chorus was, I'm just making music. All of a sudden, my life opened back up to me, and I had to suddenly make all these changes in my life, and I leaped from everything. I was in AA, I was in a relationship, I had a house, I had a band, I had a cell phone, I had the internet, and I left all that and leapt. And that moment in some ways taught me my biggest lesson. And I've definitely slipped back into those predicate states before, but not to the extent that I've ever let it totally hollow me out.
Yeah, so in a way, you actually did commit suicide.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Each one of these is a death, and that upsets some people. It'd be like, no, only death is death. But the reality is that each time we face any of these moments, the death of the ego, identity, the death of a day, the sunset used to make me cry. Every time the sun set, you know. And I think that in some ways there's a certain death meditative aspect to that that's helpful. Yeah.
So you were exploring these themes of like our desire to have like a concrete identity, while also simultaneously wanting to be something that is becoming, in the process of becoming and transforming. And it seems like very related to this notion of self-immolation. So I understand it as you destroy that concrete identity so that you can become something else. But then maybe life is just like a series of these plateaus that eventually become too constraining, and then you have to destroy them and until you get to the next one. So what, that to me sounds like a dialectic. That sounds like those two things are always going to be in tension with one another. And how do you think, I don't know, maybe this is still something you're exploring, but how do you think an individual can negotiate that throughout their life?
Okay, so there's on the one hand the thing that I've just described a bunch, and the sort of like what you just described, 1,000 plateaus, the Deleuzian, lines of flight and plateaus and becomings and beings and becomings and beings, and self-immolation, over and over and over again. And the primary ingredient in that, I think, is courage and willingness. or even acceptance. And those are really difficult. I mean, that can take a lifetime to master. Being willing to leave the relationship that clearly isn't fucking working, to leave the job that's killing your fucking soul. These things are highly, highly existentially difficult to confront,
Yeah.
and so that's a whole thing, right? Now I know people and the cases you can start to fetishize the becoming, where it's like, okay, I'm going to constantly immolate, I'm going to pre-immolate, right? Like I'm constantly declaring preemptive war on my predicate state, such that I never even allow the success to happen. Like as soon as I taste it, I fucking blow it up. And I've experienced that as well, and that is a neurotic compulsion as faulty as the clinging to the predicate state. It's no better. It's just as overdetermined by the unconscious fear of death and the unconscious fear of the annihilation as clinging to being, in the sense that I'm so afraid of, for instance, experiencing the unifying love of my mother when I was in the womb or on the teat, that I will never and always preemptively reject any love in my life that remotely reminds me of being sublimated by another, such that I'll never engage with a woman or a lover or whatever, or a friend in a way that's that close, because I'm always going to preemptively reject it, because I never want to experience the pain of having to accept it and then reject it, because that's too painful. So I'm just going to always reject this predicate state. So both of them are overdetermined by this fear, and they're both compulsive and neurotic. So, there's this intermediate ground where you experience, you witness, you become, and then you just experience when it's over and you move. And that's this, incredible description of mastery in a lot of ways. However, I do think that there is possibly a sublation of the sublations, if you will, so a culmination of the. So if we imagined, for instance, our life as intervals of becomings and beings and becomings and beings and change and stasis and change and stasis, and then we compressed all of that into a single ball, such that the entire process of the dialectic is sublated. And I'm experimenting with that right now. So that would be sort of like this Walt Whitmanian I contain multitudes thing, as opposed to I visit the multitudes and I am the space in between myselves, experiencing the self as the container of the multitudes. And right now, that's all I can say, is that I'm experimenting with it on my Bad Guru Substack. So I'm sort of starting small, and I'm starting with a little sort of rubric, but I will divulge that I think one of the main drivers of all this is status anxiety, and that there's a certain sense in which if we'd never felt the gaze of the external, that we might never consider the various predicate states, right? Because we wouldn't necessarily have a relation with which to confirm or deny our predicate state against any other predicate states. And the projections, for instance, of, oh, wow, well, okay, so Daniel is this podcaster, right? And he has Metagame. And, suddenly Daniel changes and isn't doing that. And so, oh, I suppose that failed, or that didn't work, right? I'm in a relationship and it didn't last for fucking ever. And so that relationship didn't work out. Well, what kind of fucking attitude is that?
Right.
I mean, that's giving this incredible primacy to duration, and suddenly we feel like we have to stay in these predicate states, and that an incredible amount of pressure to remain this, arrived state. So I think in a certain sense, I'm aware of that social status anxiety to the extent that I don't think that I can necessarily escape it, but I can mitigate it. And I can mitigate it by presenting myself as a container and letting everyone know that this is me But the me that I am is all of these things. And you may get one me today and you may get one me tomorrow. And if you're not okay with me variating and being a variegated self, then by all means, like, turn the other way. Let's not be friends or something. Or, I'll let you know when I'm the one me that you do like. Um, but yeah, and I'm going to experiment with that because I think that confronting that status anxiety and that pressure to remain the same or to claim the thing. So, for instance, even the trans movement, right,
Mm-hmm.
which is this incredible declaration of motion, has become for a lot of people an incredible declaration of immobility because it's like, well, now I'm going to cling to this one letter of the alphabet. This is me now, and and whatever the case, and now I identify with this, and I have my flag with that, and blah blah blah. And this declaration, this beautiful declaration of mobility, of non-binary mobility, suddenly becomes this sort of like static, compressed thing again. And I have friends that are trans and get completely lambasted by the community if they end up, being like momentarily heterosexual. It's like, you fucking traitor,
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, wait a minute. What are we? I thought we were, I thought this whole thing was about fluidity. So so yeah, there's this incredible pressure that we put on ourselves to remain in a specific state, even if we say, oh, well, this state that I'm in is totally mobile. It's like, okay, well then, suddenly we can compress that and boil it down into immobility.
Yeah, I think this connects with the tendency for the internet or for our digital ecology to compress us, and how like if
Mm.
you spend enough time on Twitter with your little Twitter avatar and like your little bio and all the stuff that you need in order to interact in that ontology, you can start to confuse who you are for that persona. And I wonder to what extent this pressure to be self-consistent across time is a function of an increasingly digital life. The more time we spend in these spaces, it at the end of the day, it's all like ones and zeros, and we have to fill out forms to kind of indicate what we are. And that's we make ourselves more legible than we actually are, so that
Hmm.
the technology can interface with us.
Yeah, man, the amount of times we're asked to externalize our identities in these forms and in these, and the amount of times we're just confronted with it, like in our bio or just our picture or whatever the case is. It's like that mirror stage for the infant happening over and over, where the parents are coming around going, that's you. That
Mm-hmm.
in the mirror, that's you. Not you, you're not you, but that thing in the mirror, that's you. What are you going to be? Again, all these externalizations of like, find yourself as if you're not yourself, find your voice as if you're not speaking with your voice. And yeah, and so we keep doing this to ourselves. And like you say, there's this movement and this drive to just keep finding more and more predicate states. And if you don't know, or I want to be a medallion member of Delta, but
Mm.
I'd much prefer to be a diamond medallion member. And then if I'm a diamond medallion member, I really want to be in the Delta, the Admirals Club or whatever, so that I can get the free banana before the plane flight, and everyone can see me getting the free banana, because then I'll feel good eating the banana. Everyone knows that I got it from the Admirals Club, not from the fucking, and so there's all these like interiors of interior, and we want to belong to the most cloistered, sheltered, sort of nested hierarchy we can. And so we end up defining ourselves further and further. It's like, I'm not just straight, but I'm this, or I'm not just left, I'm fucking ANCOM, Viacom, Schmomcom, like all these different, nested hierarchies. So I can define myself further and further. And what's interesting is that in the age of data, what we're really doing is data sorting ourselves for fucking capitalist interests. So even if
Yeah.
we're, it's like, we're just getting more and more specific so they can market to us more and more specifically, but even more importantly, market us to others, and to companies. And, because at the end of the day, we are the product. And it's it's such an interesting time to be analyzing these sorts of things.
Yeah, it's our environment naturally has these gradients or these slots that kind of like pull us into that tendency to define ourselves prematurely, because it's obviously it's useful for the goals of the system. And I think status anxiety, you mentioned it a couple of times, that's one of the main drivers. I'll share a funny story that popped into my head. Actually, last night I experienced status anxiety, and I felt it very acutely. And it'd been a while since I'd felt it like this, so I actually was able to give it enough space to kind of like do something to me, you know. And I witnessed how it was affecting me. So I was meeting some old friends, and we went for dinner, and then they're like, "Oh, like let's go get a drink somewhere." And we walked down to King West, which is a street in Toronto where all the clubs are. And basically, this is like the street in Toronto that traffics in status anxiety. Like all these places, they're designed to play around with that. You know, like there's beautiful women, there's like these cool clubs that you can only get into if whatever. And I felt it. I walked onto the street, and I saw all these people who were like better dressed than I was, because we weren't planning to go out. And I could feel it. I could feel like there was like we're in this new ontology, and there's these like promoters and stuff. So we went to this bar that used to be just like a cool bar that you could just hang out in, but now it's like turned more into a club. And they said they're gonna open in like half an hour. And then the guy said, like, by the way, just so you know, we can't let you in if you're wearing shorts. And it was like a very hot day, so I was wearing shorts, and I was the one guy in the group wearing shorts. I was dressed very nicely though, but in shorts. And he's like, just so you know. And I was like, yeah, I understand. And then I had this like knot in my chest, like while we walked away looking for another place. And I just explored it, and I realized, kind of like what you were saying, the status anxiety is a confrontation with one concretized version of myself, and then like how I'm supposed to be in this like higher status environment, or if I want to be a part of this club. And then it created discomfort. And then as I started to explore that, I started to identify more with actually what my priorities are. And I realized, actually, you know what, I don't really want to be a part of this club, at least not tonight. This is not even what I wanted. You know, I just want to be talking to my friends. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, as I say this, discovering that status anxiety and the honest experience of it can be a very powerful tool in this whole dialectic that we're talking about of being and becoming.
Man, just even recognizing that we're experiencing status anxiety is a massive step. You know, I bring up status anxiety with people that are confident that they've never even experienced that. You know, and it's like, you know, and meanwhile they're wearing like a shirt on a hot day. It's like, why'd you put the shirt on then? We're completely governed by status anxiety. You know, like in my book on Cool, which I haven't put out yet. And I think I did this on the Stoa, or a variation on it. In the book, I challenge the reader to look up from the book and say, and just yell out, my name is so-and-so, and I want to improve some aspects of my life, like wherever they're reading. And how fucking embarrassing is that? And why? And, you know, I think one of the best, I love this term that I came up with, just being a permissionary. And there's a great video that probably most everyone has seen, but it's worth always revisiting. I think it's the Dancing Man at Sasquatch Festival.
Yeah.
And you know, he is this, like, he's just going off dancing in such a way that is entirely objectively embarrassing. I mean, any of us would have status anxiety being like, if go there and dance like that guy on this hill in the middle of this thing where everyone can see you. But for whatever reason, and however he did it, I don't know if it was drugs or how it occurred, but he said, fuck it. Or he didn't. And he just got some screw loose. Whatever the case, doesn't matter. He started dancing. Then these other kids come around, they start making fun of him, and they start imitating his dance. That little molecule of collected atomized humans ended up creating an attractor of permission. Suddenly everybody had permission to do and be and express themselves in however, you know, whatever bodily motions they wanted to. And within seconds, it's thousands of people going bananas, right? Like an amazing example of the power of the permissionary and the power of permission, and and by contrast, the power that status anxiety has over us for most of the time. So the idea that, we're at like that wasn't happening the whole time, when clearly everyone's having much more fun just expressing themselves. But for whatever reason, for 99 out of 100, minutes of that concert or whatever, that was a stupid way to say it, but most of the time, nobody nobody is expressing themselves
Right.
fully. Why is that? Why? And why does it take some maniac to convince us that we're allowed to express ourselves? And why is that moment of the Dancing Man at Sasquatch Festival even worth mentioning? Well, it's worth mentioning because most of the time we're completely fucking repressed. And that's why that moment stands out. And I think that once we just recognize that, so many dominoes fall.
Yeah. What's your definition of status anxiety?
Ultimately, it's a fear of death. Ultimately, it's the fear of ostracization, and has to be recognized as a fear of death. So, for instance, I love mentioning that when we get embarrassed, our cheeks flush because we are being flooded with hormones and what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking on. The same thing that the same mix of chemicals that floods our brain when we jump out of an airplane.
Adrenaline,
endorphins, and adrenaline, and so up, and our heart rate starts beating faster when we're embarrassed, and maybe yours did when the guy said that you wouldn't be let into the club because you're wearing shorts, and all of a sudden your palms are sweating, as if someone pulled a gun on you, as if, like, why is your heart rate? Why is your heart going faster now? And it's basically all that to say that embarrassment is a survival mechanism. Embarrassment is a survival mechanism to keep us within the good graces of the group to which we belong. It's a survival mechanism to prevent us from being ostracized. And the reason why we're afraid of being ostracized is because it's built into our fucking DNA to belong as a mechanism to survive. And if we get ostracized, or we get excommunicated, or we get, whatever the case is, we equate that with a high prospect of dying, and yet it's very difficult, I think, for some people to recognize that could still possibly be at work when you fucking are asking for a lid at Starbucks. Why would we? Why something so inconsequential make us like sort of ask for directions? No, I can't ask for directions. Right. It's like these inconsequential moments, or expressing yourself, or even just walking down the fucking street. I have status anxiety sometimes just literally walking down the street, doing nothing, interacting with nobody. And then there's another person on the street. It's like, hi, should I say hi, not say hi? What's the, like, I'm just going to do that manly sort of nod. Like, what the fuck is, like, all these things, right? And so this whole protocol of status anxiety is all about sort of protecting us from death. And so once we realize that it's an existential dilemma, and we can start to draw lines to all of these neurotic behaviors, I think what then starts to unfold is like, well, what's our relationship to death? Where's our relationship to death at? And it sounds super morbid and all of that, but the reality is that we don't have any more death initiations. Yeah. We don't have any. My parents never had a death talk with me, ever. Even when my grandparents died, like, there was no conversation. We just don't really talk about it. And when we do, it's sort of like, we see it in movies, or we get into death metal and we start fetishizing it, or whatever the case. And we certainly don't, if we found out today that, a bunch of parents are putting their kids through death initiations where they drop their kids in the middle of the desert. They're like, have fun, kid. Like, hope you survive. Those parents would get thrown in jail. Like, there's almost no room or space. Like, these days you get to have a bar mitzvah or a sweet 16, and maybe if you're lucky you get collegiate hazing, and that's it. But we need to start building some like a return to sort of some kind of relationship to death, and I think we're seeing that now, budding and bubbling, and I think that's really great. The death doulas and this sort of thing, and in a sense, even COVID and these sort of confrontations with death. So yeah, I think that all of it sort of stems from, again, neuroses being the main function of it being to over-determine our lives such that we avoid death compulsively.
Yeah. Something in there that resonates a lot with me is how arbitrary this feeling of status anxiety can be. Like with people who don't even really matter to you, they can kind of prompt that feeling within you. And to me, like a very practical way that I've danced with this is by just getting really clear on the small group of people whose opinions matter the most to me. So my gang, like what is that, group of like 6 people or so, where if they thought I was doing something weird, I would then feel bad about it. But if other people think so, then I'm a little more immune, and that kind of allows me to be more principled. It allows me to have more courage, etc. And I want to share something related to this. It's kind of funny. It was recently my birthday, and for my birthday, I asked this small group of people. This is kind of a death ritual in a way. I asked them to debate my character, like go to a bar and just like debate my character for a couple hours, and then create a Google Doc of all my flaws and blind spots.
Love it.
And then on my birthday, deliver that to me as a gift, and that like locked all of this in for me, because the experience of receiving this feedback, which is kind of painful to hear from people that you love, had like a profound effect on like cracking open my ego. Like I just like all of a sudden, I felt like, I described it as like a mild psychedelic trip. Like I felt like I couldn't marshal the defenses I normally would, because I'm surrounded by people that I trust, who are all saying the same thing. And then so something kind of opens up, and then I can feel that it's coming from a place of love. So I'm able to accept it. But a very subtle thing that took a couple days to sink in was that I just felt more courageous like the following week, because I knew I was in good standing with the people that mattered to me the most. Like they talked about all the shit that I was doing. And then I was like, oh, that's it? Okay, I can deal with this. Thank you. Thanks for this, Google Doc. And now when I'm out in the world, or when I like see things online, or when I'm being pulled, across like these, gradients in the media or whatever, I feel so much more grounded, because I'm coming back to that initial group of people that I'm in good standing with. So I wanted to ask you about this, because I remember you once saying that you've always had this lifelong desire to have a crew, and that your musical projects in some sense were a manifestation of it. And I've always felt that same way too. And I think I found my crew to some extent, but I wonder if you mean the word crew in the same way that I mean the word gang. Like, what do you mean by finding a crew?
Well, I always remembered having that longing, and I think I must have told my mother something about it, and she was like, "Oh, I have this. I have the first story you ever wrote. I saved." And she showed it to me. I was like 6 years old, and it goes, "Once there was a boy who had a crew." I was like, "Wow!" And then it's like, they traveled the world, and they also knew kung fu. And I was just so struck by that this longing that I had always attributed in some way to growing up in a diaspora of Los Angeles, this intentionally strung out city with no hub and no sense of neighborhood, no sense of community, and that there were these sort of experiential aspects that had created a lack, that had drawn me to wanting a crew. But then on reading that, it's like, no, I think, yeah, but I think that this might be something even more fundamental. Because I was 6, after all. I don't think I was necessarily taking notice in that way yet. I mean, maybe I was, but by crew, I mean, I think exactly the same thing. I mean, this. It's so deep. It's hard to describe. But what I think I essentially mean is an interminable or interminable. I'm having a fucking brain melt right with that word. Anyway, whatever that is, resonance with a few others. A resonance on a psychic, spiritual level that is indescribably vast and allowing and deep and bound by more than proximity, by more than circumstance, by more than the incidental features of living. That there is something almost metaphysical about the connection. And I think part of that, and part of what's expressed in that story that I wrote when I was 6, is also crucial, is that they were traveling the world and they knew Kung Fu. And what I mean by that, and the way I interpret that, is that they had a mission. And I think that this idea of a shared mission, of a shared sense of where we're going and what we want to do and what we're creating together, is integral for me to the notion of a crew. So for me, a crew is not necessarily a bunch of guys that I hang out with and drink with and have a good time on the porch with, but a gang that is all sort of facing the same direction and walking toward something together. And that is just forever such an attractor for me and a force for me. And I think that most of my friendships have definitely been forged in the within the prospect of creation as collaborative efforts, and that the collaboration itself, the creativity itself, has sort of been the container, and the kung fu, or whatever the case is, whatever that thing is, whatever that mission is, that in some ways the mission itself is the crucible, is the initiatory aspect, and yeah, and I do in some ways still long for that, and yet I know that I have also in many ways found that. The whole Edward Sharpe thing was that. It was me drawing that in. I wrote those songs intentionally with 13 parts. I did the trumpet with my voice and a kazoo, knowing that one day a trumpet player would be there. I did all the heys and stomps and background noises and banging on a tambourine out of time, imagining all of these people, not musicians, but troubadours, marching sort of down the Rabble Road, and one by one, they all began to inhabit this space, and this incredible camaraderie and crew was really formed. And I always think about Edward Sharpe not as a band, but as this social experiment, as a crew. In a lot of ways, if I was picking for musicians, I wouldn't have picked, half of the band wouldn't have been in the band. I mean, we took people on that joined the band for a couple of weeks that had just been floated over the crowd that were playing a violin, and it'd be like, okay, you want to come? We had other people in the band that just simply weren't musicians. They could barely play their instrument. Or we had, like a whole bunch of people singing that could barely sing and play. Like everything was allowed because it wasn't about the music. It was about the heart and the soul and the camaraderie and the idea of this union, and I think that's why, for me, the band, even though we're not playing now, and I needed a break because we became too successful. It was again a case of predicate repetition and redundancy, but that band, those people, we are tied by blood forever. In this really special way because of all that.
Yeah, one of the things that came up for me when you shared that is I try to compile a short list of things that help me reduce my death anxiety. Because I remember when I first started to like really viscerally feel it, I could feel it differently on different days. And one of the things that makes me like quells the death anxiety is when I'm lost in the giving of my best gifts, like in that moment I can die and I'll be like totally content. But another one is when I'm with the crew and we're on that purpose, that shared purpose. And even like these archetypal images of, unfortunately, it's always like, people at war and stuff where like there's like this camaraderie among, soldiers. Even as a kid, I would imagine myself in those situations feeling like I could die then. Like that would be like a decent way to go. And I think there's some wisdom in it because, I initially went on this thread because I find the crew quells my status anxiety. And then you're saying status anxiety actually is death anxiety. And I'm seeing that actually it goes all the way straight to that. It creates a container where I feel almost like the aesthetics for death are suitable.
Yeah. And I think there's a reason why the band of soldiers marching into certain death is so compelling, and just as a rubric to understand how it is that a crew or a gang can sort of sublimate that death anxiety. There's definitely something there, and I must say I'm not exactly sure how or what that functions, and how it is that it quells that death anxiety or sublimates it and integrates it as this almost poetic feature of the crew itself, that there is something inherently, I think one aspect of the sublimation is actually, and perhaps embarrassingly, a sense of the immortality that comes with a crew. There's something about being with a crew that begins to feel eternalized. The moments begin to feel like they're vibrating out into sort of this harmonic eternity. And especially when that's in combination with some sort of mission, it's like this thing starts to vibrate beyond ourselves. And also, of course, the image we have of the band of brothers or soldiers marching into certain death is, of course, also the same image that Homer paints for us of Achilles marching onto the battlefield to acquire certain immortality. There's something about the beauty of that coherence that we seem to naturally associate with a sort of eternalized reverberation.
So we're coming up on the hour mark here, and I'd really love to hear you riff on the philosophy of cool. And the thing that I'm feeling connected to right now is this topic about the crew and like the common purpose of the crew. If I think about what's the common purpose for me and my crew, what's some sort of thread that's been, going throughout all of the things that we've been doing, and I'm not going to say it's, we're trying to be cool. It's that I want to make virtue cool again. I want to, like Peter and I always say this, like, I want to make virtue sexy again. I think that would be like a cool mission in life, right? Because we desperately need it to be, you know, there's so many things right now that um, are not worthwhile for the betterment of the whole, or for this whole human project, but they're, for whatever reason, they're seen as very cool. You know, all these like stupid dances people are doing on TikTok, or making money in the whole capitalist regime and all this. So part of my interest in your reflections on what cool is so that I can weaponize it, which that might be a paradox, right? Because trying to make something cool is probably the least cool thing you can do.
Not
But
necessarily. In a lot of ways, so cool is a super flexible word, and so for instance, one of the main impetuses for Edward Sharpe was I recognized in myself, at least, that the redundancy that I had created with I'm a Robot, which was essentially a sort of punk band. Post-punk, but like very, very, very sardonic and sarcastic and ironic, and I would never smile on stage unless I was bleeding, and it wasn't like that was a choice. I felt completely bound by that. I felt that that I couldn't smile on stage, and one thing I began to notice is that the entirety of the sort of subculture I was a part of, and cool in general, and I think even culturally in general, especially if we consider the late 90s and Nirvana and grunge and the sort of refusal of earnestness and the kill hippie scum or die hippie scum sort of attitude, where it's like, love and togetherness was the lamest thing you could possibly express. And it was totally suspect. And the only thing that was cool was to be sort of shoegazing and ironic and all of that. And suddenly I realized, because that was the dominating paradigm, and this will get into sort of the function of cool, the only real cool thing I could do, the only actually punk rock thing I could do, was to do the uncool thing. So to be earnest was the most punk rock thing I could do. Because it was so fucking illegal, especially in the world of rock and roll. So this is 2007. This is pre-Obama Hope. This is, pre all the sort of whatever, the pop folk stuff that came after us, and so I did it, and I did it intentionally. It wasn't like, oh, I'm just like, people have asked me like, yo man, like why'd you like walk away from the whole I'm a Robot, like that was so cool. It's like, because it wasn't cool. Because it was cool in quotations. It wasn't socially asymmetric, and so it wasn't genuinely cool. The only genuinely cool things are things that are socially asymmetrical, and that sounds in and of itself uncool because it's like formulaic. But the reality is that whatever hits the mainstream is suddenly acquired by everyone, ingresses itself into the dominant form of status anxiety, such that everyone is now doing it by rote, and it takes and requires no courage to do the thing that you think is quote unquote cool. So for instance, these days, wearing a shirt that is pre-ripped, or pre-ripped jeans, or pre-washed this, or sort of, you're purchasing you're purchasing your struggle. These sorts of things are no longer require any courage. They just require money, and then you can walk out. And also, because those things are accepted now, and you can look that way. Walking around looking like a homeless person, for instance, in Los Angeles, you can be completely confused for a rock star. And so it takes no courage to do one thing or the other. And I think in some ways that's why, cool can suddenly, we saw in the last few years, got suddenly reappropriated by the alt-right, who are like, we're the cool kids now, we're the bad boys now, because we're suddenly the socially asymmetric group. And I think in the context of what you're talking about in virtue, it's perfectly prime, society is, for virtue, for instance, to become cool. And the reason is because the dominant status anxiety sort of language has reverted once again to like an incredibly post modernist disavowal of, I'm not going to say earnestness because there is still like this earnestness, but I would say a disavowal of, I guess you could even say a virtue. That all things that avow themselves to be what they claim to be are sus. They're sus and cringe, right? And so you have all this, like, if I am presenting and saying that this is what I am, and I say that I believe in that, so again, it's sort of this sort of earnestness. Because, you know, it's like we experience these cycles in shorter intervals. So in 2007, 2008, it's like, okay, suddenly folk pop happens, and there's, you know, Home is Wherever I'm With You, and Obama Hope, and then you have, you know, like Mumford & Son, and all these sort of, like, all these things, and all of a sudden now you have this, like, rebirth of earnestness, which almost immediately gets recuperated into the capitalist superstructure as the dominant paradigm again, and suddenly now it's just being used to sell Hondas. And suddenly now it's not asymmetrical, and suddenly now on my second and third albums, I'm like, shit, I cannot iterate on Home because it's just it's already lame. So now I have to sort of back off and think about like what the fuck I'm going to do and think about. And because that interval failed to produce something that was genuinely hippie. So for instance, the people that I felt came along and reappropriated Edward Sharpe sound, which was innumerable, actually. Every time you hear a ding, 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 hey, ding, ding, like with the acoustic guitar, and it's like a folk song, and that's all straight up ripping off Home. Okay, like I have no qualms about saying like I did that, and I can no longer. The reason I can't do that anymore is because the things they ripped off about it were not the things I was hoping they'd rip off about it. I knew like the Hey thing, which I stole from Ennio Morricone. It's not like it's mine, you know, but like the thing that they stole was just the superficial qualities. And then instead of stealing the thing I wanted, which was the porousness, we made the album ourselves, we made it on tape. If you listen to Home and then you listen to sort of like, you know, I don't know, like fucking Of Monsters and Men or something, you'll hear a completely different sonic tapestry. One is like really well produced and clean, and it's got all these sort of like, you know, perfectly mastered, and, you know, there's a lot of stacking of vocals and everything is thick and blah, blah, blah. And it's all the same loudness. It sounds like all the other songs on your radio. You listen to Home, sounds like it's coming out of a garage. And what I was hoping is that people would take the garageness of it, take the porousness of it, the homemade quality of it, and be like, okay, now that is sort of going to be popularized. And I'd actually be really happy if that had been copied. But instead, what actually upset me was just the heys and hoes and things were copied, but then made completely slick to sell fucking Hondas and iTunes. And that sort of slickness I should have obviously counted on, because that's what always happens. But immediately, because that happened, the earnestness thing ran its course, right? And we're not even in that stage anymore. It didn't even get 5 years. It got like 4 years before everyone was like, nah, fuck that.
Right.
And now we're again in this stage where it's almost like, fuck that to the nth degree. Like, fuck all that. And so now we're in the stage again where what's good about that is that now we have another chance. Now earnestness has another chance because it's been left again in this socially asymmetrical position. So earnestness, virtue, these sort of things now are living in this sort of socially asymmetric darkness, and have a chance, if we, whatever, do it right, that when it's iterated on and it begins to ascend, it's not immediately recuperated into, you know, like virtue Snickers and virtue Keeblers and virtue, like, how are you going to, for instance, and this is the thing we always have to contend with, like, okay, you want to make virtue cool. How do you keep it from immediately tilting into manipulation, you know, and being reappropriated instantly and recuperated into the capitalist superstructure. Now we could say, well, you know what? And I asked myself this at first, and now I know the answer. When I was first starting Edward Sharpe, I was like, what if love becomes the dominant paradigm and everyone is in love and everyone's talking about this hippie shit and they're all being earnest? Will I still be earnest? Will I still be able to do it? Or do I actually suffer from like sort of avant-gardism where the only reason I'm even into earnestness in the first place is because it's uncool?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where am I really? And I ended up learning that it was a little more incidental to my plight than I thought. Because if I was purely into earnestness, for instance, I'm purely into virtue, and then Honda starts making all these virtue commercials, will you still be able to be like, yes, virtue, thank God, Honda carrying the torch? Or will you be like, fuck, that's a little cringy, I have to rethink this. Like, how do we have virtue? Is that still virtue? Or is it not? And I still haven't figured that out. Like, there is a side of me that thinks to myself that the full-blown commercialization and commodification of the individual vis-a-vis data, as you know, we're being traded as data bodies, and right now we're producing data, and right now we have, you know, sublimated from people into products. We are right now at this very moment, as we're speaking, commodities. Is that somehow a communism of sorts? Is there a vision that sublimates capitalism into this sort of attentionalist paradigm wherein every interaction, every behavioral moment is somehow commodified, and that commodification somehow totalizes capital such that it disappears capital behind all behavior, such that somehow in that totalization and in that disappearance of capital vis-a-vis the totality of capital, is there some silver lining? And is there some way that I can view this in a sort of accelerationist way where I'm like, okay, you know what, if we want to make virtue popular,
let's make the
cool,
t-shirts right now.
Let's make the t-shirts now. Right, exactly. Let's make the lunch boxes, the movies, like the whole thing. Let's do it now.
Celebrity
and fucking
endorsements.
Embrace the paradigm. Celebrity endorsements. Get right back into virtue, and you know, it's up for conversation. It's not something that I have a handle on or a final statement on. But to say that right now virtue is in the perfect placement to be cool because it's uncool. And you can enjoy that social asymmetry until the point at which it becomes acquired by symmetry. And at that point, there's a reckoning. And that's just seems to be the way it goes. Yeah.
So you mentioned attentionalism, which I think is relevant here. So our mutual friend, Alexander Bard, wrote about this, you know, like 2 decades ago. Well, let me put another thing on the table first. It almost sounds like capitalism does this like reverse alchemy to cool and just like converts it into profit, and then it's uncool. And it's like this whole concept of selling out, you know, like don't ever be a sellout. But the cool thing is now primed for money, and the whole capitalist machine tries to take that and then gives you the temptation to sell out, and then it's not cool anymore, but you know, you made your fuck you money or something. And what I find interesting is, if Bard is right, and I think he is, about attentionalism taking place or taking the place of capitalism, it means, and I think this is what you're saying too, if I understood you correctly, eventually the things that make money or the things that money affords are going to be so uncool that there will now be that social asymmetry for people who are outside of that paradigm. And like one example of this is Joe Rogan and his fame as a podcaster. As I see it, is entirely a function of his like authenticity and the fact that he was just vibing with his buddies. And he did that until he became, you know, the biggest in the world. And then he won the attentionalist economy there. And then he translated some of those attentionalist credits into a deal with Spotify. And that cost him, actually. I think that cost him some social credit. It was like he sold out a little bit, but he could afford it because he had so much, you know, credibility from the attentionalist paradigm. And maybe he could do that a couple more times or whatever, you know, and he converted attention into $150 million or whatever it was. But you can't do that indefinitely in this new paradigm, which is going to be based a lot on trust. Is this, you know, are Daniel and Alex saying what they believe right now, or are they trying to like posture in a certain way so that, you know, people like them? Like that to me, that's all in the same, in that same column is earnestness, is virtue, is love. It's like all these things that it's not only that they're uncool and then they're ripe to become cool, but to do them like in the real way, it's hard. It requires courage. It requires traits that most people don't have.
Yeah, and there's a slight snag that I just want to highlight that I didn't. Actually, I want to frame this as an effective woke. So in the 90s, we had selling out. And then around 2000, you know, artists started not making money from CD sales and started looking at these other advertisements. And suddenly you have Kendrick Lamar doing Amex commercials and such that would have totally been considered selling out in the 90s. And part of the way that has been allowed to occur is that is a function of woke. And what I mean by that is that, for instance, taking an idea like whiteness or patriarchy and making that the problem. Whiteness, as Du Bois pointed out, I think first, was a wage. What did he call it? He called it a wage. Anyway, basically he described it as a social wage to give to slave wage labor white people after the emancipation of the enslaved, to make white people that were still feeling like, you know, like they were totally the butt of capitalism, that were making like no money, to give them some semblance of like a sort of mid-grade aristocracy so that they could sort of almost as to assuage any potential rebellion of the lower classes.
A consolation.
And so yeah, consolation, like a wave. I think a wage consolation. He almost said it something like that. Anyway, so is this idea of like a consolation, a social consolation, but it's also to divide the lower classes. So suddenly you don't have these sort of blacks and whites congregating together, you know, complaining about capitalism or complaining about their slave wage jobs. You have this sort of division, and you have this sort of like low-grade aristocracy, and it sort of makes them feel, you know, whatever. And so this was Du Bois' sort of comment on whiteness as a wage compensation. That's what he called it, a wage compensation. And then you have this idea sort of start to promulgate, which is that whiteness is essentialized to the white person. So as opposed to it being a compensation or a social, you know, compensatory mechanism to create these divisions in class and all that, it's actually now being rethought as essential to the white person, essential to the white worker, essential to the white man, the white woman, the white person, such that whiteness actually refers to them in their essence, not as this trick played on the white person. Whiteness initially was thought of as this trick played upon the white person to convince them that slave wage labor was okay, to give them this consolation prize, to convince them to keep working for, you know, tiny ducats, right? And then suddenly now it's not that. It's actually essential to the white person. And suddenly now whiteness is the problem, as opposed to the capitalist structure, as opposed to the slave wage labor that yielded whiteness in the beginning. Similar with patriarchy, right? It's all the man's fault and these sort of things, and they all have total validity. But the problem with identifying the problem as within essentialized to the specifics of essential to the man or essential to the whiteness. Suddenly now the capitalist structure gets to go away scot-free.
Right.
Suddenly now it's not the problem of the capitalist structure, it's the problem of the whiteness and the man. And now if we can start to just get women up into those positions and black people up in those positions, everything will be fine. because the capitalist structure is not the problem. It's actually these essentialized characters that were participating in that structure. And all of a sudden you lose the systemic analysis. And by losing the systemic analysis, suddenly we can celebrate when Kendrick Lamar does an Amex commercial. You know, we can celebrate these moments of Black excellence or of women becoming CEOs and this whole thing, and all of that, or the first trans, you know, billionaire, or whatever the case is, and totally forego the systemic analysis. And that has been pretty damaging to. Well, let me just put it this way. Okay, so this was all just to sort of precede the conversation with regard to how it is that selling out is no longer a thing. Okay, sorry, I found myself. So the thing I wanted to state is that cool, vis-a-vis this move by woke to essentialize the systemic analysis into a personal analysis and leave the system alone, woke has done an incredible thing to cool, whereby it has left the system of capitalism as totally fair game for cool, such that cool can now access the entirety of the capitalist system without being uncool, because it has directed all of the mainstream anger and angst onto and projected it onto these essentialized characters, which are the patriarch and the white race. And by doing that, suddenly it leaves the capitalist structure alone. And now you have, you know, the coolest kids I know drink Coca-Cola. They listen to Beyonce. They have no problem with anything capitalist. In fact, it's ironic and cool. It's like the less fucks you give about selling out in the sort of capitalist context, the cooler you are. And so this has had this incredible benefit to the capitalist structure, where the man or the mainstream or the thing we're rebelling against has been projected to be outside of the capitalist structure. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola, you know, because it's so inclusive and it has all these amazing commercials, they're the, you know, the number one polluter of plastics in the world. They number one cause of type 2 diabetes, which predominantly affects people of color. But none of these things are of any importance, right? Because it's projected that Coca-Cola is this sort of, you know, inclusive brand. Anyway, all that to say, I've been really mystified by any lack of this selling out sort of thing, and so that if we're going to bring virtue back into things, I would imagine that virtue somehow has to confront a more equanimous. Boy, I'm really making up words today. Equanimous take on social hierarchy and capitalism, economics, etc., such that things like the truth are not thought of as cringe. I mean, we're living in a time right now where facts are cringe, the truth is cringe, there is no sort of reality. We're all living in our personal bubble, and that is the spiritually correct way to view the world. It is the evolved way to view the world, that everything is made of alternative facts. But my question is, from that place, how can we possibly improve the world? How can we possibly avoid a totally atomized state wherein which we are simply the grist of data mining? So it's a really interesting double twist that's been done, where there is no selling out anymore. In fact, selling out is cool. Selling out is ironic. Selling out is a statement of defiance and of giving no fucks. And it's that right there has left me in a very, that's been on my mind for the last 10 years as I've seen that go down, and as I've witnessed, you know, the sort of crumbling of virtue around systemic analysis of capitalism, and as I've witnessed suddenly the ascendance of selling out as viewed as some sort of disruption, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think what's kind of confusing about this is the different uses of the word cool, because maybe it's cool to sell out right now in the sense that it's acceptable. And then you're saying that that's also giving this asymmetry where the things that are not acceptable in the mainstream are like ripe to become the next cool thing. And so I feel like there's two definitions of cool there. One of them is what's like quote unquote cool, like acceptable. For whatever reason, it's now acceptable to sell out. But then the other is like what's actually cool with a capital C, which hasn't come to pass yet, because once it does, then maybe it's not cool anymore.
Yeah, it's got these double meanings all over the place. It's like you know, it's difficult. The the word that I've been using for the socially asymmetric cool is sort of like cachet, because it actually means, like a uh, uh, hidden and sort of cloistered cachet or cache of value, and that cachet disappears as soon as the social asymmetry disappears.
Mm.
And yet it is ingressed into the mainstream, and in a lot of ways, the teleology of cool is to become mainstream. I mean, hence the whole idea of ascendance. Um, and I think I think what's also interesting to bring in is like just the struggle that, we talked about belonging and a crew, and I think that that's in a lot of ways what drives cool. The whole, how many hipsters take a screw in a light bulb, what you don't know, what you're not a part of this crew
Mm.
thing is about, like this cloistered group to which we all want to belong, which somehow has a premium on the kind of esoteric knowledge that we're interested in. But that esoteric knowledge has to be like, the handshake is a version of esoteric knowledge. The nod, the password for the club, these sorts of things are contextually asymmetric, and they must be somehow. And part of the sort of neuroses of wanting to belong is the desire to belong against the struggle. So we form these struggle clusters, and usually the struggle clusters are the ones that are the most cool.
Mm.
The greatest struggle cluster possibly ever is the African American, and clearly the coolest struggle cluster that has ever been also, which also have their own password, which only they can say, which we all know what that is. And I mean, it's this incredibly powerful example of belonging and the struggle cluster. And yet you see sort of, this sort of this envy to belong to that, and to want to be a part of something like that, if not that. And I think that a lot of our neurotic affiliations are driven by a desire to belong to something like that, and to set up oppressors as people who are saying my pronouns wrong, or whatever the case is. Like, oh my God, how could you? And I have this, I have similar I have a similar predilection. Like I look at all that with envy. And then I also have my own things where it's like, like the hippie thing, or I'm going to be earnest, or I'm suffering from this like constant desire to be on this sort of avant-garde, to be part of this sort of socially asymmetric moment. Because listen, I'll join you. You want to start this thing with virtue? Cool, I'm in, until it gets too cool, and then I'm out.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because it's not going to satisfy my struggle cluster compulsion anymore. And that's something that I have to constantly look at, because to be truly virtuous is to be in this sort of more steady place where no matter what the sort of, framing that transpires, I'm sort of still in the place I was in before. I still want what I wanted, and I still believe in the things that I believed in, no matter how fucking popular they get. In fact, wasn't that the point? And that's something that I think most of humanity, especially most of the hip kids in the world, will simply not look at. They simply, everything I just said, they'll be like, oh, borderline cancelable, because it's just too confrontational to look at any impetus that is non-essential. It's like, no, I am this because I am this. There couldn't possibly be any other reason why I'm attracted to the things I'm attracted to. And yet the desire to belong is just so powerful that it has to be looked at if we're going to be honest. And I think that's another function of virtue. And I'd also say that, the thing that you've set up with Peter, the whole stoic label, and the idea of, for instance, the way you carry yourself, which is in a lot of ways similar to Peter. You guys have, both of you, a sort of stoic predisposition. And I don't know if it's a predisposition. You have a stoic disposition. Right. I don't know how hard you've had to work for it, right? But it does do a thing where, in contrast to me, when I'm expressing myself and I'm all sort of like effervescent and I'm jubilant and I'm getting excited and I'm rambling on, and then I hear you talk, I'm like, damn, I like that. How do you do that? Could I do that? Is that part? I wonder how hard I would have to work to do that. Like, maybe there's something he knows that I don't know. Maybe he's like more in touch. Maybe that's like, there's an emptiness there. There's a sort of portalhood to this that's going on. Or no, maybe I'm portaling and that's why I'm flowing. Maybe that's why there's a deluge happening, is because I am vacant. Maybe I've done the work, or have I? And anyway, it introduces this question that I start to get this FOMO for your disposition. I'm like, okay, hold on, let me do this. Yeah. Well, I think that one thing, fuck. And I start freaking out, like, shit, I can't do it. I don't know what this is. Get me out of here. And in other words, I'm very attracted to the otherness, right? The thing that isn't me, the place where I'm not at. And the ability to be centered throughout a conversation and stay in the same place throughout a conversation. And I wonder to what extent that's actually associable with virtue. And I would think that for most people it's very associated with virtue, because if we're being limbically hijacked all the time and we're being thrown around like rag dolls, and I'm able to go from this emotion to that emotion, this idea to that idea, well then in theory I'm more manipulable and prone to be sort of just the incidental subject of advertising. Whereas in a more stoic, removed sort of repose, I might be able to sort of subsist through those entreaties. And these are all just questions that bounce around within me. And yet there's also this thing where it's like, well, what do I do when I'm alone and I've suddenly hit an ecstatic moment of creativity? Well, I bounce around, I start shouting, and I get giddy, and I start laughing like I'm some fucking, sidekick henchman. And I, drop to the floor and I clasp my hands and I do a little dance and I get naked and I start fucking writing things on the typewriter and I make up new words. And I act kind of like how I'm acting right now.
Right.
And so sometimes it's like, well, okay, I have to honor that too, right? That's obviously somehow central to my being. But I will say that before I get to those states, like you said, I do have to empty myself. In the morning, I meditate. I'm quiet as fuck. I get into my meditative pose. I do stretching. I ask for the angels and muses to inhabit me. I invite them. And sometimes I can hear that they're not interested, and that means that I haven't, I must know too much this morning. I must not be empty enough this morning, because there must be no room in me for them to fill. They must be like, well, let's go somewhere else where we can have some input, because this guy apparently knows it all. I totally went off course there, but yeah. To say that or the idea of being other than what I am, or experiencing this state of sort of constancy, is like when I started, the idea of like, I want to be the I contain multitudes.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be a centralized figure within which the ghosts of my muses may inhabit as they please, and yet to always be centrally located to myself, and not to feel like I have to burn myself up, and not to feel that sort of necessity of courage to push through one skin into the other, but to be the permeated skin that subsists and consists of the constantly unclosed universal self. And, you know, to the extent that's possible, well, you know what? I'm not going to demur. That's fucking possible. I know that that's possible.
I agree.
Because I've experienced that for moments, right? And if I don't think that's possible, you know, and I'm totally willing to fail, by the way. Of course, failure, I like, you know, it's good to have these goals that are impossible, because then that bakes in failure. And I'm totally willing for that. But I do think it is possible, even though it could fail. I'm only saying that so that you don't think I'm naive. The reality is, I think it's totally possible.
Yeah, you know, in closing, just to kind of see if I can compress that beautiful deluge in the last couple of minutes. I think the word that kept coming to my head is integrity. You know, because we were talking about virtue, and then you kind of articulated the different ways in which you and I are showing up. Where I'm coming off with this stoic disposition, which I've been accused of before. And you're being more expressive and free. And
now see, okay, but I'm gonna protest. But keep going. But I'll protest later.
All right. So all I want to say is that I think what matters from a virtue perspective is the sense of integrity and what you have integrity with. So if I have integrity with this appearance because I think Alex is going to think I'm cooler if I'm like super stoic, and then I just like keep doing that, that's not virtue. That's
hilarious.
Right? And so there's something else. And I think it's that thing that is hard to name. It's that thing that you just admit it is possible to actually achieve, even though it sounds naive. And having integrity with that is what I think is like that fundamental, I guess, unit of virtue, regardless of whether or not you show up like a stoic or like a Dionysian madman.
Yeah, man. And also, you know, the Dionysian madman. Yeah. If there's one thing I want to allow and give myself permission for, I will say that I do, you know, whenever I'm made comfortable or I'm engaged in such a way where someone's like, I want to experience what you have to say about something, I end up finding myself I start levitating in this way, and I start, you know, I start experiencing this, and I'll only just witness myself doing this. It's almost impossible, I think, for me to whip myself into something like this intentionally. And so I recognize a certain integrity about that state. But at the same time, there is a beautiful and something I'm very drawn to, which is the repose of sort of like taking a breath and being. And you know what it is? Okay, here's a good story. It's not a story. This is something I do all the time, and you mentioned it at the top of the podcast. Being on stage and performing, you get into the modes where suddenly things are clicking, and by I'll precede this. The thing that I do before I get on stage sometimes, and I'll just bring this in the context of the thing that I do sometimes that is relevant here, is that I will get intentionally the most anxious status anxiety. I'll drum up the most status anxiety I possibly can as an exercise to create a impenetrable brick wall of status anxiety, such that the only way to pass through it is to dissipate myself, such that the ego no longer exists. Otherwise, I cannot contend with this brick wall of status anxiety. It's too much. If I go out there as me, I will fucking get crushed by the sheer weight of this anxiety. And so I must die before I go on stage. And so that's what I'll do. And sometimes I'll smoke weed, which makes me very anxious in that sense. And I'll smoke weed and drum up that anxiety intentionally, go out, see the crowd, and until I get to that point of like that limitation of no return, and suddenly I have to drop it all. So anyway, I'll go out on stage at this point where I'm no longer visible to myself and I'm not there. And we get into the music and it's happening and it's all flowing and I'm in it and I'm in the zone. And all of a sudden, I'll make a move that I realize was not deigned by the fucking authority of the muses. I did something because I thought it would be cool. Or I made a move, or I did, like somehow I did something. It was a turn of the hip. It was another snarl. It was some bullshit that was not real. And suddenly all my alarms go off. And the reasons they go off is because suddenly I'm back in my body. That brick wall is present. And the only thing I can do in those moments, and the thing that I do, I've learned to do, and I think this is like, if there was anything I was going to communicate to people about, like what to do when that happens, I stop. Sometimes I literally stop singing, but I definitely stop my body. I stay in one place. Sometimes I drop the microphone, I stop singing lyrics, and I wait, and I breathe, and I become nothing. I become a vessel. I just stop. And from that place, eventually, hopefully, some instinct returns, some initial impetus. You get to zero again and get that initial impetus. And I guess that's my relationship to the stoic state, is that it is fundamentally and has to be my home base. It is, without it, there is no, you are just flipping lids. There is no base to the container. And yeah, it's just essential, man. And by the way, this energy, when you hold down this energy in a conversation, when one half of the conversation is holding down that base, it almost makes it the heights to which I feel comfortable going increase, because you sort of present an oscillation between the base and the heights, where it's like, okay, and you not only remind me that I can go there, but in some ways your very presence means I don't have to go there, because it's like we're a one made of two, of which one part is nothing, which is literally like Zizek's quote of what sublation is: a one made of two, of which one part is nothing. And by nothing I mean sort of the base form, that again, that access, that at the beginning I talked about excess, the relationship between excess and absence, and that they're really the same thing, and that to acquire the ecstasy of the excess, you have to have your denominator in the absence. They're one and the same thing. They represent the same thing. They present themselves in some ways, quantitatively excess, qualitatively absence. And yeah, I just always loved that combination, that dance. It's just crucial.
Alex, thank you very much for this conversation today.
Wonderful, man. Thank you so much. And it's so nice to finally talk to you. This is great.